England did something no other nation at the FIFA World Cup 2026 can claim, and almost nobody talks about it. Every single team stepping onto the pitch in the United States, Canada, and Mexico this summer will be playing the modern version of a game that one country codified more than anyone else: the offside rule, the throw-in, and later the 90 minutes. The very idea of 11 versus 11 chasing a ball into a net. All of it grew out of rules that were written down, argued over, refined, and formalized in England across the early decades of the modern game. 48 nations will compete for the greatest prize in sport, playing by rules whose modern form began in England's game. And England, the country that gave the entire world its favorite sport, has won the whole thing exactly once. Most people assume the reason is simple. England just isn't good enough. The players choke. The manager gets it wrong. Bad luck at penalties. But that explanation misses something far stranger, because when you actually line England up against every other contender in this tournament, you don't find a team that's slightly worse or slightly unluckier. You find a team that is in almost every meaningful way the exact opposite of everyone else. The opposite history. The opposite relationship with pressure. The opposite gap between what they've given football and what football has given back. England isn't just another team hoping to win in 2026. England is the strangest paradox in the history of the sport. And by the end of this video, you're going to see the World Cup completely differently. I'm going to walk you through exactly how a nation can be the birthplace of the modern game and the eternal outsider in it at the same time. How the country with the richest, most watched league on the planet keeps arriving at the World Cup as the team most likely to break your heart. And why the thing that makes England the opposite of every other team might, just might, be the thing that finally works in their favor. Everything here is rooted in verified football history. No easy myths, no careless exaggeration. Let's start where the modern game itself started. To understand why England is the opposite of everyone, you have to go back to 1863. Not to a stadium, not to a pitch, but to a meeting. On the 26th of October that year, representatives from several clubs and schools gathered at the Freemasons Tavern in London and founded the Football Association. Over a series of arguments that autumn, they hammered out the first unified laws of association football, beginning the formal separation of football from rugby-style codes and creating the foundation of the sport we recognize today. 9 years later, in 1872, England played Scotland in the first ever official international football match. It finished 0-0 in front of a crowd in Glasgow. Think about that for a second. The first international football match in human history involved England. The rule book the whole planet still argues about began in England. Modern association football didn't spread to England from somewhere else. It radiated outward from England to everywhere else, carried by sailors, engineers, and traders to South America, to Europe, to Africa, and Asia. And here's the first great inversion. Every other footballing giant you can name received the game as a gift and then fell in love with it. Brazil turned it into art. Argentina turned it into religion. Italy turned it into a chess match. Germany turned it into a machine. They took England's invention and, in many cases, mastered it better than the inventors ever did. England gave the world a language and then watched the world write better poetry in it. That's not an insult. It's the central mystery. Because if you invent something, you'd expect to have a head start. England had the biggest head start in the history of the sport. And it's the reason the next fact hits so hard. When the first World Cup was held in 1930 in Uruguay, England wasn't there. Not because they weren't good enough, because they didn't enter. The Football Association had fallen out with FIFA, the sport's global governing body, over disputes that had been simmering for years. And England sat out the first 3 World Cups entirely, in 1930, 1934, and 1938. The nation that codified modern football looked at the first World Cup and effectively said, "This tournament isn't for us." Imagine the arrogance and the strangeness of that. The rest of the world built a global celebration of England's game, and England refused to attend its own party. By the time England finally showed up at the 1950 World Cup in Brazil, they arrived carrying the swagger of the game's founders. And that's when the pattern that has haunted them ever since revealed itself for the first time. England, the mighty codifiers of modern football, lost 1-0 to the United States, a team of part-timers so unfancied that when the result came through, some newspapers back home reportedly assumed it was a typo and printed the score as 10-1 to England. It remains one of the biggest upsets in World Cup history. The teachers had come to the classroom to show off, and the students they'd never even taught beat them. So set that image in your mind, because everything about England's identity flows from it. This is a team defined not by dominance, but by expectation crashing into reality. And that brings us to the single most important thing you need to understand about English football, the thing that separates them from every other nation in 2026. Every great footballing country carries a burden of expectation. But England's expectation is a different creature entirely, because it isn't based only on what they've done, it's based on what they gave. Brazil expects to win because Brazil has won 5 World Cups. Germany and Italy expect to win because they've each won 4. Argentina expects to win because of Maradona, because of Messi, because of a lineage of triumph. Their pressure is earned. It's backed by trophies in the cabinet. England's pressure is almost mystical. It comes from a feeling that the sport belongs to them, that it started with them, that it must, surely, one day return home. That feeling even has an anthem. In 1996, a song called 3 Lions gave English football its unofficial motto, 3 words that would go on to haunt an entire nation. It's coming home. Football's coming home. The very phrase turns the dream into a homecoming, as if football itself has been waiting to return to the place where the modern game began. Now here's why that matters. And here's the psychological core of this whole story. There is a simple principle in performance psychology that shapes everything: the gap between expectation and reality. When reality exceeds expectation, you feel elation. When reality falls short of expectation, you feel devastation. And the size of that devastation depends entirely on how high the expectation was set. Most teams at the World Cup manage their expectations. England cannot, because their expectation isn't set by a coach or a bookmaker. It's set by 160 years of history and a song the whole country sings in unison. Every single tournament, England walks out under the weight of a promise nobody can actually keep. And that impossible weight has produced the most specific, most exquisite form of sporting suffering the game has ever seen. Which is the part I really want you to understand next, because it's where the paradox becomes almost cruel. If England were simply bad, this would be a boring story. They'd lose early, everyone would shrug, and life would go on. But that's not what happens. What happens is so much worse, and so much more fascinating. England gets close. Agonizingly, repeatedly, heartbreakingly close, and then loses in the most painful way a football match can be lost. At the 1990 World Cup, England reached the semi-final and lost to West Germany on penalties. At the 1996 European Championship, on home soil, they reached the semi-final and lost to Germany on penalties. At the 1998 World Cup, they went out to Argentina on penalties. In 2006, they went out to Portugal on penalties. At the 2012 European Championship, they lost to Italy on penalties. A generation of English fans grew up learning a specific kind of dread: the slow walk of a player to the penalty spot, the held breath, the inevitable heartbreak. And notice the shape of that suffering, because it's the opposite of everyone else's. Other nations often lose because they get outclassed, outrun, outthought over 90 minutes. England, more than almost any major football nation, has become associated with the trauma of the shootout, with the single cruelest, most random, most nerve-shredding way the game offers. At their defining exits, they often don't get humiliated. They get to the very edge of glory, and then have it torn away by the width of a post or the guess of a goalkeeper. It's the difference between a team that fails and a team that is haunted. And it explains why, before I show you how this story might finally be changing, so many people had come to believe England were simply cursed. But a curse implies bad luck, and what happened next proves it was never really luck at all. Now, before we get to that turn, I want to point out something you may have felt already while watching this. Notice how the closer England gets, the more it hurts. That builds to the biggest question of all, the one this whole video has been circling. If England codified the modern game, exports the richest league on the planet, and produces world-class players in almost every position, then why the drought? And the answer, when it finally arrives, isn't about talent at all. Because here's the fact that breaks the not good enough theory completely. England is home to the Premier League, the most watched and commercially powerful domestic football league on earth. A competition that pulls in the best players and coaches from every corner of the planet. The English game is not poor. It is spectacularly, absurdly rich. The infrastructure is elite. The talent pool is deep. So the shortage was never ability. Look at the last decade and the picture sharpens. England reached the World Cup semi-final in 2018, their best run in nearly 30 years. Then they reached the final of the 2020 European Championship, played in 2021, at Wembley, their home stadium, and lost to Italy. On penalties, of course. Then they reached the final of the 2024 European Championship and lost again, this time to Spain. 2 major tournament finals across one 3-year cycle. This is not a team that can't compete. This is a team standing on the doorstep of history, again and again, unable to walk through the door. And that reveals the deepest inversion of all. For most nations, the story of their football is a story of peaks, of golden generations that arrived, conquered, and faded. England's story is the opposite. It's a story of almosts, of being the eternal nearly men of a game they themselves created. No other country carries that exact contradiction. The founders who have not won the World Cup since 1966. The richest league without the ultimate prize. The anthem that promises a homecoming that never comes. Every other team in the 2026 World Cup is chasing a trophy. England is chasing a ghost. The ghost of 1966, the one and only time it all came together. Because it did come together once. At the 1966 World Cup, hosted in England, a team captained by Bobby Moore beat West Germany 4-2 in the final at Wembley after extra time. Geoff Hurst scored 3 goals, the first hat-trick ever scored in a men's World Cup final, and still the only one scored by a player on the winning side. For one golden afternoon, the codifiers of the modern game were also the champions, and the natural order of the universe seemed briefly restored. And then nothing for 60 years and counting. That single triumph is both England's greatest glory and its heaviest chain, because it proves it's possible. It proves the promise isn't a fantasy. It just refuses to be kept. So we arrive at 2026, and the strangest twist of all. The World Cup 2026 is unlike any before it. It's the first tournament with 48 teams, the largest in history, hosted across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. More matches, more chaos, more pressure, more chances for the favorites to slip. And into this expanded, unpredictable arena walks England. Still the opposite of everyone. Still the birthplace that hasn't won since 1966. Still the team carrying an anthem instead of another trophy. But here's the thing about being the opposite of everyone else. It cuts both ways. Because think about what actually causes England's specific heartbreak. It's the gap between sky-high expectation and reality. It's the tightening of muscles in a penalty shootout when an entire nation's mystical, historical, song-fueled hope is resting on one kick. For decades, that weight was pure poison. But something shifted in recent years. England learned, slowly and painfully, to actually win shootouts, beating Colombia in 2018 and Switzerland in 2024, moments that would once have been automatic defeats. A team that once feared the spot began to master it, and that matters, because the very thing that made England the opposite of every other team, the impossible pressure, the fear of falling short of an unkeepable promise, is a thing that can be trained, managed, and eventually flipped. When reality finally rises to meet a wildly high expectation, the result isn't devastation. It's the greatest release of joy the sport can produce. England has spent 60 years being the team that falls just short, which means they are also the team with the most stored up, unspent, unbearable amount of joy waiting to be unleashed the moment they don't. So here's what actually makes England the opposite of every team in the FIFA World Cup 2026. They didn't inherit the modern game, they codified it. They didn't skip the early World Cups because they were weak. They skipped them through institutional pride and a deep dispute with FIFA. At their defining modern tournament exits, they often don't lose because they get outclassed. They lose on the finest, cruelest margins in sport. They don't carry expectation earned by a long list of World Cup trophies. They carry expectation earned by giving the world its favorite thing and getting far less back than the myth seems to demand. Every other team is trying to write a new chapter. England is trying to close the oldest, most painful open loop in football. And whether they finally do it in America, Canada, and Mexico, or whether the ghost of 1966 haunts them for another 4 years, one thing is certain. No team at this World Cup will be playing with a heavier, stranger, or more beautiful weight on their shoulders than the country where the modern game began. If you found yourself seeing England and this whole tournament in a completely different light, then do one thing for me. Subscribe. I break down the hidden stories, the strange history, and the psychology behind the biggest moments in football. And the World Cup 2026 is going to be full of them. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens when the team that's the opposite of everyone finally steps onto the world's biggest stage. Because if football really is coming home, you're going to want to be here when it does.